Molly, welcome to London. Welcome to Narmod. Thank you so much for being here. It's really wonderful to have you.
I'm absolutely honored to be here. And also, I mock what you call a heat wave.
Yes.
As someone from New York, where our subways are fermented canals of human shit, where rats faint from heat exhaustion, what you call a heat wave?
I know. It's also an unfortunate time because every British person you meet will want to talk to you about the weather, so it might get a bit repetitive. But maybe you can say, "Why don't we talk about the Bund instead?" and watch them look very confused. So, Molly, let's start at the beginning. Why did you want to write this book?
Well, I grew up obsessed with my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was a post-impressionist painter named Samuel Rothbard, who taught my mother how to paint, and my mother taught me how to paint. And so I always viewed my very capacity to make art as a sort of gift through time from him. And he was what you would call a character. He had produced thousands of paintings of sculptures that hung all over my great-aunt's home, my mother's apartment. I grew up hearing the stories about him, how he took back his own paintings from the Brooklyn Museum because he didn't like where they hung them, and then would put them on his front lawn and say that he was creating the Rothbard Home Museum of Direct Art, competing with the MoMA. How he set up a no-kill chicken farm during the Depression and left his wife to care for 1,000 quarrelsome roosters while writing poetry about the glories of pacifism. And he had one body of work that I really loved as a young person, and that was what he called memory paintings, which were hundreds of watercolors that he did of Volkovisk, the small town in Belarus that he came from. And they were every aspect of life. They were himself reading Torah for Yom Kippur, himself lighting his rabbi's shoes on fire because he was a bad student at religious school, himself spying on the woman's bathhouse, his mother chasing away rats, the Russian soldiers getting drunk and playing the accordion, every aspect of life. And there was one painting that stood out. And should I do a reading to talk about that painting?
Absolutely.
Would you have to give me your book, though? Apparently my book is sold out in a lot of bookstores in London, so I wasn't able to get one myself.
I read it in 2 sittings, everyone. It really is as amazing as all the reviews say.
During his elder years, my great-grandfather, the post-impressionist artist Sam Rothbard, tried to paint back into existence the murdered world of his shtetl childhood. Amidst the hundreds of watercolors that he called memory paintings, one stood out. A girl, silhouetted against some cottages, her dress the same color as the crepuscular sky above. A moment before, she'd hurled a rock through a now shattered cottage window. On the painting's margin, her boyfriend offers more rocks. Itka the Bundist breaking windows, Sam captioned the work. I may have been 15 or 17 or 20 when I saw that watercolor. In my great-aunt's sun-baked living room or my mother's apartment. I don't recall exactly. What sticks with me is the old-world awkwardness of the heroine's name, Itka. I turned the Yiddish syllables on my tongue. And Bundist. What was that? This question became the thread that led me to the Bund, a revolutionary society of which my great-grandfather had been a member, whose story was interwoven with the agonies and triumphs of Jews in Eastern Europe, and whose name has all but been erased. But this thread did not merely draw me back into the vanished past. It became a guide for our moment, in all the horror and possibility, in all its repression, courage, and loss. Founded in 1897 in the city of Vilna in the Russian Empire, and reaching its height in interwar Poland, the Bund was a sometimes clandestine political party whose tenets were humane, socialist, secular, and defiantly Jewish. Bundists fought the Tsar, battled pogroms, exalted the Yiddish language, and built vast networks of political and cultural institutions out of little more than love and grit. Seeking to liberate Jews from the poverty and violence of interwar Poland, they raised their children on the radical ethos of working-class solidarity and subaltern pride. Ultimately, these youth helped lead the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. Though the Bund was largely obliterated by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, The group's opposition to Zionism better explains their absence from current consciousness. Though the Bund celebrated Eastern European Jews as a people, they irreconcilably opposed the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The diaspora was home, the Bund argued. Jews could never escape their problems through the dispossession of others. Instead, Bundists created the doctrine of Dokheit, here-ness. Jews had the right to live in freedom and dignity wherever it was they stood. They would fight for a better and more beautiful world, even alongside people they had been raised to see as their enemies. The more I dug into the Bundist past, the more I realized it was not past at all. It was rather a candle to illuminate the tumultuous present. Despite war, state collapse, and genocidal repression, the Bund fought for the very multiracial democratic socialism that a new generation now champions at the ballot box. The Bundists built alternate worlds of beauty, of courage, and of hope, which allowed their people to persevere even in the midst of an apocalypse. Their ideas are still vital today. The Bund was a Jewish group, but its history is not for Jews alone. It belongs to all of us who believe in the necessity of human solidarity. In the story of the Bund across decades and geographies, ages and faiths, I found the story of our own time, a blueprint for survival, a cautionary tale of death, and a philosophy that might yet save us.
Maybe you want to keep it just in case you want to do more readings. Thank you, Molly, and really, your words really jump off the page in terms of painting this idea of not only this incredible story of Jewish life, and I say that in particular because, I think for so many of us, those of us who have family who come from Eastern Europe and went through the Holocaust, and even sort of the public understanding of Jewish life or a Jewish experience in Eastern Europe, I think before, during, and after the Holocaust is one of death and misery. I think that is the story we are told. And what I found so mesmerizing, I think, by what you were writing was the vibrancy of life that the Bund created. And I'm curious, what did it mean for you to go through the process of writing this book in terms of learning Yiddish, traveling to Ukraine and Warsaw to the sites of your ancestors, and how did that impact the ways in which you decided to tell this story with such a vibrancy?
I'm not an academic, I confess. In fact, I do not have a college degree. I went to the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, where you were allowed to paint your feelings instead of writing papers. And I felt no desire and no ability to put on the drag of an academic. I wanted to write a story about the Bund that showed them as flawed, complicated, ridiculous, infuriating, cunning, courageous, sexy, beloved human beings, as our ancestors. I wanted to show history not as the study of bones that you dust off and put in a glass case, but as the study of people like us. And so, in order to do that, I needed to do an intense amount of research. In order to write this book, I learned Yiddish. I took this extremely rigorous summer program in New York where elderly Yiddishists will beat the language into you no matter how donkey-like and slow your brain is. I was not a brilliant student at it, but nonetheless, I could read socialist texts by the end. Then I read every single book I could on the Bund in English, Spanish, French, and Yiddish. Those are the languages I had. And some of these books were incredibly out-of-print books that I had to track down to a warehouse in Queens. Or they were crumbling pamphlets that only existed in like one archive, and I had to photograph them and translate them. Some of them were the deadliest dull of socialist prose that you could imagine, the sort of socialist prose that would suck all of the fucking blood out of a vampire that had just fed. And I would have to read these, and I would think, like, how do I get them back? How do I get the life back? How do I do the necromancy to get this back? I did intense archival research on the Bund's periodicals, but not just the Bund. You can't trust a political movement about themselves. I read their enemies, right?
Of course.
The Zionists and the Bolsheviks, too. I went to Latvia, Lithuania. I went to Poland twice. I went to Ukraine during the Russian invasion. so that I could walk the streets that Bundists walked. I went to the places where Bundists lived, where they were murdered, where they are buried. I talked to many elderly descendants of Bundists, people like the great poet Irena Klepvich, a pioneering lesbian poet, whose father, Michael, was the Bund's bomb maker in the Warsaw Ghetto. People like the labor leader, Mark Ehrlich, whose grandfather, Henrik Ehrlich, was the Bund's martyred leader. And especially I looked at memoirs, especially women's memoirs, because I wanted to see inside people. Like the people I chose to focus on, a lot of the decision was because they wrote good memoirs. And I wanted to know what they were like. I also focused on women, not just as an ideological thing, because I'm a feminist, though I am, but because often women's memoirs were more skeptical, less doctrinaire, more concerned with the actual practicalities of life as opposed to the hot wind emitted during conferences. And then the other thing, and the final thing, is I've spent my whole life as a socialist. My father's a Marxist. I grew up in it. And I felt no need to pretend that these people in the left of their era were fundamentally different than the people that I knew. And so I brought my own experiences to bear, including knowing the comment, not a question man, the dictator of the book club, the leftist meeting that you want to climb through a crack into the wall to escape because it's so boring and it's gone on so long. And I put myself into it, not because I'm special necessarily, but because I'm from the present. And I wanted my presence in the book to be a bridge to the past.
Yeah, I really want to come back to that idea of what does it mean to write this book in the present. But before you do, as someone who has sat through many, many leftist meetings, I was just wondering, was there a particular favorite piece of Bundist bureaucratic archival material that you found that you were like, this has to make it into the book, this is so important, or something where you're like, I cannot believe that they sat around talking about the same things that we still talk about every meeting?
I mean, there's so many. There was the piece of paper I found in an Amsterdam archive where it was clearly someone who's supposed to be doing minutes, but then instead he drew an elaborate drawing of someone taking a shit in a hat. They're like us. There was Trotsky's notes about the Bund, this very determinative Congress, Third Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party that was taken. This Congress was held in the back of a Belgian wool cooperative that was infested with fleas.
Oh, God.
But also you read the minutes, and I'm sure that so many of us who have done organizing, we know what it looks like when someone hates someone else, because that person fucked their girlfriend.
Yeah.
That person snubs them at parties. That person has an irritating face. And we know what it looks like when, instead of saying, I hate that person because he fucked my girlfriend, you say, I hate that person because he's an imperialist. And you can, when you read the minutes, you can really see that.
You can really see it. Yeah, they're just like us. This idea of, our present, and obviously whenever we write about the past, we're also, I think, writing about our present. I think we can think about it in two ways. I think the first, most urgently, is what did it mean to write a book about people essentially chronicling their demise, of a genocide, of violent fascism, against a backdrop of Israel's genocide in Gaza. And I know you've been to Gaza, and I know you talk about that in the book, but I'm curious about that experience and what that was like for you, and what, was there an intentionality about helping people understand what's happening now by talking about what was happening then?
The whole creation of this book is very interwoven with Palestine. I had been fascinated by the Bund, and I had known about the Bund because of my great-grandfather, but it, for a long time, was just one of those like cool family tidbits, like if you knew your grandfather was a juggler, And I went to Palestine. I went to Palestine in 2015 as a guest of the Palestine Festival of Literature for the first time. And in that trip, you British, you use the word blagged. Is that the correct British slang when you're kind of scamming?
Blagged your way in,
I blagged my way into Gaza. I blagged my way into a press pass so that I could go to Gaza. And, when you're in Gaza, and this is, before the genocide, right? This 8 years before the genocide, but it was 1 year after Operation Protective Edge, when the Israeli army decimated this neighborhood called Shujaiya. Like, they bombed it, they shot shells into it, they had bulldozers that destroyed the house. It was like a fucking eraser descended from the sky to wipe out people's lives. That's what they're trying to do. And I had been to Syria. Like, I was not naive about what a war zone looks like. And this was something different. And also just being there with the claustrophobic, prison-like nature of it, with the sound of drones overhead, with the sea that is blocked off by Israeli warships that you can see the lights at night. All of this, and being with these like fine people who live there, it makes you so angry. It makes you so fucking angry at the ideology and the state that would do this to these people, that would lock them up in this open air cage like that and shell them periodically. And so I went home after this trip, and I was doing one of my vices, which is getting drunk and looking on Wikipedia. And I saw...
Which we've done together, Molly.
We have. Oh, shit, that's right. Fuck, man. At a strip club. And I saw that the Bund was anti-Zionist. And that was interesting, because I was like, you're not just an anti-Tsarist group that my great-grandfather was part of. You're not just, an underground group that did strikes and sabotage, as he said. Like, you're also anti-Zionist. And what does that have to do with the fact that no one knows about you? And so that was what sent me down the original quest to write about the Bund. And I wrote a piece for the New York Review of Books in 2018 that is still the most viral piece I've ever written. It's something that people still stop me on the street over. And that piece and the connections I made, the elderly people who came to me, that's why I decided to write the book. And it was because this movement that was a socialist, humanistic movement that believed in so many things that I believed in, to me, had clearly been marginalized and pushed off the edge of history because it rejected Zionism. And I spent 7 years working on the book. It was not a book that I wrote in response to the genocide in Gaza. I started it long before. But I did the massive bulk of writing after the genocide began. And that was because in spring 2023, I was again in Palestine, a guest of the Festival of Literature there. I presented on the Bund in Ramallah. I spent a lot of time on Mariam Barghouti's roof, eating cherries and having a blast and listening to good music in Ramallah, and came back ready to start a fellowship at the New York Public Library that I was like, this is going to be my time. It started September 2023. And the genocide began a month later, and I still know people in Gaza still. And to see this genocide carried out, to see these braying donkeys that from their unelected and highly compensated posts claim to represent the Jewish community speaking in support of this genocide, to forensically reconstruct the genocide against our people, because I wrote about a third of my book is about the genocide, and especially about the Warsaw Ghetto, while also seeing Gaza liquidated like Warsaw was, block by fucking block. It did something to my head that it's hard to speak about it in specific terms, but it was something that fundamentally changed me, just like the genocide changed so many of us. And I immediately got involved in both protesting against it and getting arrested, to protest the genocide, and also trying to help my friends in Gaza get out. And I think writing this book throughout the genocide, but also throughout the failure, our failure to stop the genocide, was something that marked both the book and me fundamentally.
Thank you, Molly. And I really resonate with what you just said. I think we're all living in the after, and almost as if the world of pre-genocide in Gaza almost feels like a hallucination in some ways of how could this has been such a profound shattering of how we understand our world and how we understand our life. And I think that's what I really took from reading those points in your book of like describing that life of, even in the Warsaw Ghetto, I think you were very clear to sort of talk about the life in the Warsaw Ghetto as well as the death. But it also almost feels quixotic or hallucinatory, this idea that we were all walking around sort of having normal life at the same time while this thing was happening, and this horrific thing was happening that has completely fractured and changed our world. And we kind of lived through and it's ongoing, but we're also in a sort of slightly different parallel now. And I think it's very interesting to also be reading your book at this time when this moment has, as you say, the brain donkeys of our mainstream communities who supported this has forever, I think, fractured what it means to be a Jew in the world today. I think it has created such profound questions for all of us. And I think that's where, again, like what you're writing about in your book, not only, but I think particularly the Holocaust and the creation of the ghetto, around these fractures that were happening in Jewish life in Eastern Europe, around what is this solution to our future, whether that be, obviously there was a lot of Zionist organizing at this time, and Bundist and Bolshevik, and I'm just curious as to were you also thinking about the sort of fragmentation and fracture of Jewish life as well in the wake of, not only in the wake of the genocide, but in particular whilst writing this book?
I mean, I actually think that Jewish life has never been unified, ever. Not geographically, not ideologically, not religiously. And the idea of the singular Jewish community is almost a way that Zionists assert hegemony, right? That they shut people up by saying that they're marginalized from it, that they're not part of it. I'm from New York. It's the largest Jewish city in the world, and it has been for the entirety of the 20th century, in fact. And it's a city that has such diversity of Jewish opinion that there are two Hasidic sects that look exactly alike that fucking hate each other. They hate each other so fucking much that one of them does angry marches in the other's neighborhood on Sukkot, and the other dresses their kids up in mocking costumes on Purim to make fun of the other one. So for me, like, this idea of like the Jewish community and the singular Jewish opinion, not only is it a historical lie, but it's a present lie. It doesn't exist, right? And I think that one of the things that authoritarian and fascist movements always try to do is they always try to assert a false unity, that there's only one way to be a German or English or Jewish for that matter. And one of the things that I wanted my book to do is I wanted to give us back our history of dispute, which is actually the most fundamentally and probably one of the things that I would say is one of the true Jewish values. And Jewish life in Eastern Europe was a place of profound dispute, right? It was a place where you had Bundists who defiantly asserted their right to stay in their homes, but who also celebrated their Yiddish culture, who celebrated their particularism, duking it out with Bolsheviks, who also thought Jews should stay in their homes, but that they should erase anything particular about themselves, duking it out with various forms of Zionists, with dogmatically religious people who would get into punch-ups because someone was selling a newspaper on Saturday, duking it out with assimilationists who thought it would just be better to convert to Christianity and fit in. And the idea that we were ever one way has always been a lie, I think.
Yeah, I think in particular, in terms of that one way or that monolithic narrative, turning to your talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I'm sure many people here resonate. I was always taught about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as a very Zionist story, that it was the beginning of Draw and Hashiva Hatzair, these Zionist youth movements. And when I went to Poland on March of the Living, we all took photos outside the monument of Draw. I'm sure other people here have done this too. And I'm just curious as to how do you feel like the Bund can help us see this story differently? And what does it sort of tell us? I think, you've spoken a bit about how even in the ghetto, everyone is always who they are. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the sort of challenges that were also happening between these sort of Zionist movements versus the sort of Bundist movements as well, even when they were trying to literally stop the liquidation of the ghetto.
Warsaw was the largest Jewish city in Europe at that time. It was about 300,000 people, Jewish people there. It's about 30% of the city. And these people were herded into an area about the size of Central Park, and there was a wall put around it. And even starving, even dying of typhus, even being rounded up for sadistic labor camps, people remained who they were. Gangsters kept being gangsters. Showgirls kept being showgirls. Religious people kept being religious people, and socialists kept being socialists. And what this meant was that you had Jewish political factions who were risking their life in the ghetto to produce newspapers. And what did these newspapers print? they printed denunciations of other Jewish political factions for not understanding Marx. And the Bund kept up their resistance from the first days of the Nazi uprising. They fought in the trenches and on the barricades of Warsaw alongside Polish socialists after the government of Poland, the national government, had abandoned the city. They reconstituted as an underground group that made soup kitchens, educated kids, and underground schools, tried to fight back pogroms that the Nazis staged with their fists. They begged people not to go into the ghetto. Arthur Ziegelboim, who was a Bundist representative who died here in London of suicide, trying to raise attention about the liquidation of the ghetto, he was forced to be a member of the Judenrat, and which was the Jewish council that the Nazis appointed to organize things for them, like classic colonizer fashion. And he, when they told him about the creation of the ghetto, he publicly urged a group of 10,000 people to resist going in with their bare hands if necessary, and then he quit the Judenrat and smuggled himself out of the country and eventually to London, where he served on the Polish government in exile. In the ghetto, the Bund continued their underground, their papers. They were the ones who sent their member, Zygmunt Friedrich, a blonde man, a blonde Bundist, they dressed him up as a railway worker and they sent him to follow the trains to Treblinka to reveal the truth of the Treblinka death camp. And it was Jan Karski, the Polish Home Army courier, that smuggled Zygmunt Friedrich's report to England and America. But they also had a vision, which was that they saw themselves as part of a larger Polish socialist movement. And they saw the liberation of the ghetto had to come at the same time as the liberation of Poland from the Nazis, which is both a statement of profound solidarity, but also just factually true, right? There's no world where the ghetto is liberated and the Nazis maintain power in Poland. But because of that, they refused initially to work with the Zionist youth groups Dror and Tashomar Hatzair. It was really two activists from Dror, Selina Lubetkin and Antek Zuckerman, who were the first to propose a united Jewish combat group. And initially, the Bund rejected it because they didn't want to work with Zionists, and also because they thought that the idea of having a rebellion inside the ghetto without it spreading to the larger city was an act of suicide. Then the Nazis murdered 90% of the ghetto. And the Polish Home Army, which was the largest resistance force that would ever exist in Nazi-occupied Europe, did nothing to stop it because they didn't consider Polish Jews to be their problem. The Polish Home Army had its own plan, which was that they would, murder Nazis when they could, but they would do acts of sabotage when they could, but that they would build up weapons and they would build up guns until either the Allies or the Soviets were close enough. And then they would launch an uprising to free the country. And at the point that the ghetto was liquidated and 90% was murdered, the Soviets were still in Stalingrad. And the Americans had not landed in Europe, and so they did nothing. And after that, after 90% of the ghetto was murdered and the Bund's adult leaders were murdered, or else in hiding in area in Warsaw, the Bundist youth movement, Zukunft, decided they didn't give a fuck about ideology, and they decided to unify with Zionists and also with communists. And they created the Jewish Combat Organization. Incidentally, the Jewish Combat Organization did refuse to unify with right-wing Zionists, which had a separate group that had shootouts with them. But nonetheless, history is messy. And this group of young people who were very young, some of them were 13 years old, like Luciak Blondis, a Bundist, armed with 50 pistols that they got from the Polish Home Army, homemade Molotov cocktails, homemade landmines, and light bulbs filled with battery acid, and one machine gun. They held off the Nazis from the ghetto as long as the country of France held off.
Pretty amazing, right? I mean, understanding, I think, again, thinking about this story and how the courage of it, but also I think for many of us who also are maybe frightened or concerned about taking back or understanding or being proud of this history because of the way it has been used in service of pro-Israel national building, Israel indoctrination in our communities. And so, I coming back to this, it's like, how do we reclaim these? What is the different story or the different lesson we can take from this, aside from, military might, Jewish military might is what we need. What is the actual story that we are trying to take back here?
The story that I think a lot of people are fed is that in between the destruction of the temple by the Romans and the creation of Israel in 1948, that there was nothing but ash, and that there was just weak Jews who were humiliated and murdered and pogromed, and then finally they were all gassed, and that in order to live, you have to be a strong Jew, which means being an Israeli, which means doing war crimes against other people. It's either that. You are oppressed or you're the oppressor. That's the dynamic. And I think that the Bund's story shows that it was far more complicated, that Jews did fight back. They fought back with fists and with guns. They fought back against dehumanization in every possible way that they could, and all sorts of Jews too, Bundists and not, right? Communists, people of no religion, people of no ideology whatsoever, right? Just people asserting their human dignity, gangsters, That the thing that Israel wants us to take from this is that the Bundists died because they trusted in other people, right? But the thing is that solidarity, those relationships with other people, are the only thing that can save anyone. There's no alternative to that. There's only savagery without that.
Well, also a lot of Zionists died too. I mean, this idea, like, not everyone could leave, even if there was this desire for everyone, or for immigration, or for people finding safety rates. Obviously, as we know, millions of people were not able to do that, including people who had different ideologies.
No, of course. I mean, the Jewish Agency was very picky about who they took. I mean, in the 1930s, Ben-Gurion was sending people back to Europe because they were sick or because he thought they were lazy. They only wanted what they called good human material, right? People who were going to work. But also, I mean, a lot of the Zionist narrative about why the Jews of the Yishuv lived, it's bullshit. It's based on this idea that they lived because Palestine was this magical place that had a force field of protection and they were strong. And that's not why they lived in the Yishuv. They lived in the Yishuv because Palestine was a British colony. And the British, not the Yishuv, the British were able to stop Rommel at Al Alamein. And if that battle went the other way, and if Rommel took Palestine, the Yishuv would have been murdered, just like the Jews of Poland. And it's actually a matter of contingency that Jews in Palestine survived, nothing more than that.
Yeah, and I think it's also, there is, and maybe this, what we as Jews love to talk about our intra-Jewish drama and politics, but I do think sometimes that focus on us and what we didn't do is a way, and you talk about this obviously in the book, particularly at the end, no spoilers, wasn't great. But I think at the end when it's like, this is also a story of the failure of Western states, basically, right? This is also a story of, this is a question of how do we think about power as well, in terms of how do we understand what happened to the Bund and what happened to everyone, all Jewish people, but not only Jewish people at that time, right?
And what happened to Europe, right? I mean, I often think about hypocrisy, right? And how hypocrisy is one of the most corrosive things to ethics. And when you have states that put on the mantle of democracies, that speak about freedom and democracy and human dignity, and then so profoundly fail and spit upon the basic obligations of human solidarity of their time in the way that England and America did during the Holocaust, of course it creates a space for violent supremacist ideologies to thrive. And I think we see this corrosive effect of hypocrisy now, right? When states that talk about the rules-based international order and human rights not just co-sign the genocide in Gaza, but in fact arm it and are participants in it.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very important lesson for us as well, because I think that, we are also constantly grappling with this, this struggle around the deep anger and resentment we have to our own communal leaders, to our own, the co-optation of Judaism by our communities in service of genocide or in service of support of genocide or Zionism or colonialism or apartheid. And also there is this bigger picture around what politics of the sort of Western world does Israel's existence serve as well. And how do we balance those two things, I think, is something that I think was such a useful, don't want to call it an allegory, but I think a parallel in the book that you were writing about this broader context in which, the Bund is one tiny part of this story of like what happened in Europe in the 1930s, but it's a very informative one, I think, for thinking about these questions and that's why I think also perhaps this book resonates also beyond Jewish people as well.
Well, I always wrote this book not to be a book just for Jews. Like, this is a book for the left, and it's a book that I believe belongs to the history of everyone who's a rebel, everyone who is a fighter, everyone who fought for the better and more beautiful world, whether they're Mexican or Iranian or Palestinian too. I think that often when Jews write about our own history, we segment it off and we put it in this little box as if it's not part of world history, but that's not true. And I wanted to return our rebel history to world history.
I have two more questions and then we'll come to the audience. My first question is, what was there anything, and this was actually a question, thank you, Natalie, for helping me talk about it, but like, was there anything that you uncovered or discovered in your research that didn't make it into the book, that you're like, this deserves its own canon of work, its own artistic work?
I mean, everything. I mean, the Bund's story is the story of the first half of the 20th century, as seen from the point of view of the valiant defeated. And I mean, I could have written so much more about a Bundist who went to Palestine in 1924 because he was running away from the Polish government, and then reported on land evictions and reported on the deliberate impoverishment of Palestinian workers by the Histadrut, which would do violent pickets to try to expel Palestinian agricultural workers from their jobs. And
it's a union. It was like the first Israeli union, trade union.
An all-Jewish union. Arabs weren't allowed to join until the 60s. They reported about the deliberate dispossession and impoverishment and the ripping of people, farmers, from their homes. And this Bundist, by the time that he had returned to Poland in 1930, he had taught Warsaw's Jewish working class what Zionism actually meant. Not the pious lies about how it meant like international brotherhood and friendship or about empty land, but what it actually meant, which was that it meant eviction and dispossession and impoverishment and the denial of political rights for Palestinians. And I didn't write about that in my book, but there is an amazing book that's coming out next year that's called We Traitors. It's edited by two amazing scholars, Nathan Tankis and Aisha Berich. And it is hundreds of pages of translated Bundist writing about Palestine and Palestinians. And that is a book that I think is going to be crucial, and I think it's going to blow open the field, because there's been a lot of lying about the Bund's anti-Zionism, a lot of attempts to soften it, attempts to say that their problems with Zionism was that they spoke Yiddish and Zionists spoke Hebrew, that they didn't care about Palestinians. All of this, it's a lie. It's absolute bullshit. The Bund opposed Zionism because they were socialists, and socialists believe in human equality.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so interesting also, just reading the reviews of your book. People keep saying, this forgotten history of the Bund. And it's like, it's not forgotten, it's erased, right? That's the point, is that in order to tell these stories, there has to be sort of, and that is not a unique thing to this story. This is something that happens with all history and with all sort of the victorious narratives that we tell ourselves. But I think it is very interesting that even now people seem so surprised that this exists, that this hasn't been written about in this way, or perhaps in such a public way, or in a post sort of in this moment of like, I guess, like Jewish fracture or the re-rise of Jewish anti-Zionism, whatever. But it is so interesting that there is this desire to say this was forgotten rather than this was intentionally left out. Do you feel like in other parts of your work, as a journalist, as a writer, as an artist, that you see parallels with this, with maybe your work in Syria or other activism that you've done in New York? Is it like, do you see that sense of what is forgotten versus what is erased, and how we bring those stories to light?
I mean, there's always this bullshit cliche that journalists use that's so infuriating whenever I hear it, which is giving voice to the voiceless. Everyone has a fucking voice. Every fucking human has a voice. There are just some people who aren't listened to. And I have always been attracted to the stories of rebels, right? Of people who perhaps the boot of power is on their face, but they rebel against that every day. And that's always what I would write about in my journalism, whether it was taxi drivers who were going on hunger strike to get out of debt peonage in New York, whether it was activists in Puerto Rico who were rebuilding after the hurricane, or whether it was activists in Syria or Lebanon. And I think that one of the things that deeply informed my book was the over a decade I spent documenting history as it happened.
My final question, and then we will come to the audience, and then we'll come back to have a closing from Molly. But obviously, much of this book centers on your great-grandfather, Sam Rothbard, and I'm curious if you've thought about what he would think of this book and your attempt to bring this history to light.
He would say, finally had a book written about him, and it was long overdue.
Great answer. My grandfather would say the same. Okay, we're now going to open it up to audience questions. We're going to take 3 at a time. Please be mindful of Molly's reference to it's a comment, not a question, guy. When
I
you're
will
asking,
be brutal. If there are comments instead of questions, you will be cut off, and everyone will laugh at you, so don't do that.
But we do have time, so if people want to raise their hands, we'll take 3 at a time. And I'm just going to get my pen so I can make sure they're written down. This person here with glasses, and then we'll go this person in the middle with the sleeve and the white T-shirt. Okay, thank you so much. I will go to the next one. Yeah.
Hi, Molly. Thank you very much for the talk. I had a quick question. In the book, Reflections on Binationalism, Shlomo Sands wrote a little bit about the Bund and how, like, towards the end, like, sort of 47, they resisted the partition plan, but they sort of advocated for, like, a one binational state, so there was, like, a recognition of Jewish nationality. Of course, there was a small Israeli Bund also after 67 that was like even, I don't know if like two-state solution, but more advocating to like recognize the state of Israel and all that. So I think the question is like, what do you think happened there in the trajectory that like sort of led to this, a little bit of the change in the consensus of the Bund and all that? So.
Thank you. And our final question at the very back, if we could pass the mic on. Yeah.
Hello. Oh. Thank you both so much. So I've got a sort of two-parter. So I want to ask, what is the value of explicit anti-Zionism in today's sort of Jewish movements, as opposed to, say, progressive Zionism or non-Zionism? And the second is, what can we learn from Bundist anti-Zionism and socialism, and how can we apply it today?
Thank you.
Great.
I'm going to try to remember everyone's questions.
I've written them down so I can tell you.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to start with yours. The reason that you say that you're an anti-Zionist, because as opposed to a liberal Zionist, is because Zionism is fucking racist, and you don't want to be fucking racist. That's actually why. Like, I mean, Zionism is the ideology of the genocide, and liberal Zionism is the sort of delusion that only Americans are dim enough to keep in their heads. It crumbles whenever
it's not just Americans, sorry.
But it's something that crumbles on any contact with reality. And I just like, how could you look your Palestinian comrades in the face and identify as a Zionist? It's the most basic thing. Anti-Zionist. The value of the Bund's anti-Zionism and socialism. So their anti-Zionism, it was built on 4 different parts. At the start, because they were founded in 1897, a lot of their opposition to Zionism was because they thought that this was a crackhead fever dream that didn't have a chance in hell of happening, and was actually a scam by Jewish bosses to get away with paying their Jewish workers starvation wages by giving a little money to a yeshiva in Palestine, much like we see many billionaires today whitewashing their names with small charitable donations. They also thought it was acquiescence to the same bigots that wanted to kick Jews out of Europe. But after the Balfour Declaration, which gave Zionism the backing of British imperial power, they opposed it because they were against imperialism and because they were socialists who believed in human equality, and for all the ethical reasons that I told you about. They saw the land evictions, they saw the denial of Palestinian political rights, they saw the racism. There's a line in a 1929 book by Yosef Chmurner that was written after the 1929 Palestine riots, where he describes Polet Zion, which is a left Zionist group, as the ugly snout of national chauvinism appearing behind the beautiful red mask of socialism. And I think the ethical opposition to Zionism, which is based on universal humanism and universal human values, is something extremely powerful. In terms of the question about Shlomo Sand, so I want to give a little context to where the Bund was after the war. After the war, the Bund tried to rebuild in Poland, and Polish nationalists murdered 1,000 Jews after the war. The Soviet-backed government of Poland forced the Bund and the Polish Socialist Party to liquidate. This led the majority of Polish Jews to flee to displaced persons camps that were in American-occupied Germany. And from there, they applied for visas. And the vast majority wanted visas to America. Because when you've just survived a war and you've lost everything, very often the best place to rebuild is somewhere where you have family. And that's where the largest Jewish community in the world was. In those displaced persons camps, Zionist groups quickly seized control of the camp administrations, which meant that they controlled people's rations, their housing, whether they had jobs. And they would use this control to enforce what they called a draft. And this draft, it might sound insane, right? Because there was no Israel, there was no state. And the people that they were drafting are in Europe. It was enforced by the Haganah to coerce people first by taking away their food and their housing in DP camps, and later by beating them and their family members to join up to the Haganah and participate in the Nakba. The Bund resisted the draft. They reported on it for the Bundist press. They were beaten. They were stripped of their jobs, of their meager rations. There is a line by Shlomo Mendelssohn, a Bundist pedagogue, that he wrote in early 1948, where he said that it's shocking that Jews, who were the primary victims of fascism, had adopted its methods. It was, quote, as if the slaughterer had infected his victims with the germs during the slaughter. During the Nakba, they reported on the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes, and they would demand the right of return and compensation as well for those Palestinian refugees for over a decade afterwards. The small Bund that existed in Israel were refugees from Poland, people who were politically persecuted out. They tried to run for the Knesset once, and they were not able to get enough money or enough votes to even feature on the ballot. And they largely became what I would call a cultural support organization. But even that group, which again is by this point a small group of impoverished refugees who for years had trouble meeting because anywhere that tried to give them a hall to rent like this was threatened. The leader of that group wrote in 1957 that their historical duty was to fight against the Zionist nature of the Israeli state. They were and remained an anti-Zionist group.
Thanks, Molly. And then the final question was there a moment where you thought, when doing this research, oh, if only something had been different? Right?
Yeah, I mean, all
all of it.
I mean, yeah, all 20. It was the 20th century. Yes.
Great. Yeah, that's succinct and to the point. Good. Okay, other questions? Oh, wow, so many questions. Okay, I've got one in the front row.
So Zionism was always a bourgeois movement. And this is an irony because you have these like labor Zionist groups pretending to be socialist. But in actuality, the kibbutzim were never self-sufficient. It's something that's pretty obvious. If you take people with no farming experience whatsoever and you put them in a very different climate than what they grew up in and you say, make a successful farm. Doesn't usually happen. Farming is really hard. All of human existence has been about not being a subsistence farmer. It's not an easy way to make a living. Certainly it's not easy to compete with people who have spent hundreds, perhaps thousands of years farming that land. So these agricultural settlements and colonies in Palestine were always dependent on wealthy Jewish philanthropists. They were utterly incapable of existing otherwise. And so because of that, any sort of like class war or socialist element in Zionism had a lot more resemblance to a trust fund teenager telling their mom to go fuck themselves than they did to the sort of socialist class war that the Bundists or the communists or all sorts of other groups would have advocated. And in addition, there was a real like whitewashing function, right, of giving to philanthropies or giving to the colonial project in Palestine, which was that the people who did it often were severely underpaying their workers in Europe. And the Bund deeply saw Zionism as a scam. But there was another element too, which was that there's always been a real willingness of Zionists to make deals with anti-Semites. And there's a scene that I talk about where Vladimir Medem, who's a major Bundist theoretician, he goes to World Zionist Congress because he just wants to see what's going down, and writes a mean report later. And he's horrified because Theodor Herzl talks about a meeting that he's had with Vyacheslav von Plev. Vyacheslav von Plev was the notoriously racist Minister of the Interior in Tsarist Russia, who most Jews at the time held responsible for the horrifically bloody Kishinev pogrom, and who was an out-and-out anti-Semite whose secret police printed and distributed the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And in the meeting, Herzl says that he had managed to get von Plev to support him in his goal to get land from the Ottoman Sultan to colonize. And the price of that acquiescence was that Herzl vows to stop the Jewish Labor Bund from organizing. Something he had no power to do, by the way, just to be clear. He was also a bullshit artist. But that's the sort of promise that he was willing to make. And
how did he even suggest he was going to do that?
He didn't think he was going to do that.
Okay.
I think he was just like, oh, von Plev thinks I'm the king of the Jews, and I can tell them,
yeah.
you know. But this sort of bullshit artistry, it becomes much more deadly in interwar Poland. So the Polish government in the last, between 1935 and 1939 is led by a quartet of empty-headed military men with very nice square jaws and very nice medals and no fucking ideas in their heads, who also lack the charisma of Pilsudski, who is the military leader who was considered the founder of modern Poland. And because they have neither charisma nor ideas about how to deal with the economic crisis, they decide to lean into racism. We've never seen anyone do this now. And their plan for how they're going to get Poland out of the economic crisis is that they're going to steal all the stuff of the 3.3 million Jewish citizens and then deport them all to Palestine or to Madagascar. And to advance this plan, they fund terrorist youth groups that go through Jewish neighborhoods screaming Jews to Palestine while throwing bombs into Jewish shops and beating people to death. They also create a boycott backed by the Catholic Church of Jewish shops to ruin them. They impose racial segregation in Polish universities. They do all sorts of things to make life shit. At the same time as they're doing this, they are giving weapons and money and military training to Zionist paramilitaries, to the Haganah, to the Irgun, and to Lehi, aka the Stern Gang, because they want Jews out of Poland. And the Zionist trainees at these military training camps have to sign pledges that they will leave Poland after their training so that they don't use this training to defend their own communities.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a really, really interesting talk. My question is, what were the ways that the Bund was growing and building as a movement, and what lessons can we learn for Narmod and the Jewish left today? Yeah, thank you.
I actually think their lessons are good for the whole left. I've always thought that their history, just like if I was looking at the history of the Black Panther Party, is something it's good for the entire left to learn from. But the big thing that I think the Bund offers us is that they were living in a time of polycrisis, of economic collapse, of rising fascism, of a war that would soon consume them, of a deeply racist society. And a lot of times when leftists are looking at that, they're like, what do we do? Do we run people for office? Do we do mutual aid? Do we do communal self-defense? Do we protest in the street? What do we do? And the Bund's answer was, you do everything. So the reason that they became the most popular Jewish party in interwar Poland is because they did everything. They ran people for electoral office. They had amazing city councilors. They were deeply involved in the union movement. The trade union movement was the Bund's roots. They came out of that. By the end, over 100,000 workers were organized into their unions, including workers that were excluded from other unions like peddlers and maids. They had a beautiful cultural life that they built. They really were the sort of people who believed that nothing was too good for the working class, and they had theaters, they published books, they had newspapers in 3 languages that reported on high art and internationalist socialism in Yiddish, the language of the Jewish street. They had a women's movement, they had a boy and girl scout group, they had a teenage movement, they had summer camps and hikes.
Sports clubs. Sports clubs.
The most popular sports club in the country was a Bund sports club, soccer leagues. They had sports press. They had a sanatorium for slum kids at risk of tuberculosis called the Medem Sanatorium that was run on Montessori principles, that didn't beat kids at a time when beating kids was bog standard, and that let kids have their own parliament and newspapers and make decisions. They also defended themselves. They had a paramilitary that defended them from not just the attacks of racists, but also the mafia, and also was useful for persuading landlords not to evict people.
And we have one more question over here, and then...
Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
I'm just not sure that your definition of anti-Zionism was the same as the Bund's definition post-war. You've got David Slutsky in your reference list, and he talks about the Bund conference in Montreal in 1955, where the Bund unanimously passed a resolution that welcomed Israel as a part of the Jewish world, while rejecting Zionism's insistence that Israel was the home of the entire Jewish people, and that concern for the Jewish community in Israel should be subordinate to the well-being of the Jewish community around the world. I think they had a different conception of anti-Zionism than you're
and
talking
in that
about
same
here.
and in that same conference, I believe they demanded the right of return for Palestinian refugees and compensation.
Yeah, and that's right. So they should
Sorry,
be
it's not a
demanding
back
things
and
like that.
forth. Sorry. Thank you. Yes, let's do some online questions.
This question is from Julian. How has being an artist enabled you to write this book?
Great question.
I think that I have more of a concern for the visual than perhaps a typical historian would have had. So when I was researching, I didn't just want to know about the resolutions that were made in conferences. I wanted to know what it felt like to stand outside of a jail or to paint a banner, what a hectograph machine looked like, or what sorts of tangos were played in interwar Poland. And I think that sort of emphasis on the sensual reality of life, I think that that's something that marks my whole book, and I think it comes directly from me as an artist and also me as a non-academic, I would say.
Other questions from online? Nope. Okay. Okay, I'm going to suggest that if you are someone in this audience who maybe doesn't usually ask a question, might feel a bit nervous, that I would love to hear from some people who maybe don't normally take part in Q&As. So
Yes, please. In fact, in my experience, the people who feel nervous at Q&As are inevitably the ones with the most interesting and deep questions. And also, I don't want you to feel like if the question is about something obscure or small in my book, that's equally valid. So whatever you like, whatever's in your heart, please ask.
Yes.
There is. I didn't record it, but I'm going to re-record it because I found out that the writer the recorder, who is a talented actress, she didn't know how to say Yiddish names. I heard.
Great. Other folks who never really ask a question.
There's one over here.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. The lights are a bit hard. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, and Chavrashaft. I wanted to ask, you've talked a little bit about how the Bund's anti-Zionism might resonate in the modern day and its organizing strategy, and I was curious how we might learn today from the Bund's alternative to Zionism, from national cultural autonomy, not just as Jews, but on the left as a whole. Thanks.
In some ways, in some ways, national cultural autonomy, it's a concept that comes from Austro-Marxism, right? It's something that comes from these vast multi-ethnic empires, like the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Tsarist Empire, which had many, many groups of different people who spoke many languages, had many, many religions. And it was a way of dealing with the fact that people lived in very mixed communities, but that they didn't need to live under the oppressive hegemony, for instance, of everyone having to be Russian, be Austrian. But also that to have independence movements would inevitably mean partition, ethnic cleansing, and the creation of new minorities. And the Bund's idea, which is an idea that it's almost so obvious that it doesn't sound revolutionary, is what if everyone could speak their own language and practice their own culture and not be ethnically cleansed? Imagine. They could just stay in their homes. And even though it's not the exact form that they would have recognized because we live in a vastly different time, in a lot of ways I find New York right now has this. When you go to vote in New York, your ballot has many languages. When you go to the park, the sign has many languages. You can go to school in Spanish or Haitian Creole. The election flyers in my neighborhood are in Yiddish. And this, again, is a recognition that people can live alongside each other, speaking different languages, having different cultures, getting state support for those cultures as well, while also fighting together for the better and more beautiful world.
We're going to take one more question from someone who doesn't normally ask questions. Yep, let's go here. Oh, sorry, here. Sorry, apologies. You can ask there. That's fine. Yeah, thank you. And then we're going to come back, and I have one more question for Molly, and we'll close.
Thanks. I really love the book. One thing I noticed was there are lots of examples in the book where the Bundists put their faith in solidarity from non-Jewish Polish socialists and are really disappointed and everything goes awfully. But there are also lots of examples, which I was sort of pleasantly surprised to read about, when people did show solidarity who weren't Jews and risked their lives and did things like that. And I was wondering, were you surprised by that in your researching for the book?
This was probably the most gutting thing to research in my book. So I had come into it with the preconception that the Polish Socialist Party, which was the Bund's sister party, had betrayed them. Right? That was really what I believed going in. This wasn't based on facts. It was just based on vibes, basically, from conversations with survivors. And so when I started reading these memoirs, I learned that actually the Polish Socialist Party were comrades. They had gone to Auschwitz for smuggling the Bund's party press. They had forged documents. They had hid their children and Bundists themselves in their homes at a time when hiding a Jew meant death for the whole family. They had snuck into the ghetto to have meetings with Bundists. They had taught Mikhail Klepvich how to make Molotov cocktails. They had done all sorts of things. But, and this is the crucial thing, and this, I think, is the heart of why I was so fucked when I was writing these parts, because it really fucked me up in the head. This book really destroyed me, is that, remember I was telling you about how when it came time for the rebellion, how the Home Army, they didn't help the Jews during the liquidation, and during the rebellion, they gave them minimal help, but they did not want the rebellion to spread to what was called the Aryan side of the city. And the reason that they didn't want the rebellion to spread was that the Americans had not yet landed, the Russians were in Stalingrad, and if Warsaw rose up, no one would save them, and the city would be destroyed. And the Polish socialists agreed. And that, to me, was the limit of what that solidarity was, that the Polish socialists were willing to die for Bundists. They went to Auschwitz for Bundists. Polish socialists were killed for helping Bundists. But they were not willing to sacrifice the Polish city. And I have a part, it's different than I was going to read, actually. Can I read a short part? Is that all right?
Yeah, this one or this one?
Let me see. That, where I deal with this. Because the thing was that about a year after the ghetto revolt, after the ghetto was burned in the center of Warsaw, the Russians finally did get to the suburbs of Warsaw. They got to Praga. And They urged the Polish population to rise up, and the Home Army listened, and they did rise up. And then the Russians watched on the other side of the river and waited until the Germans crushed them, because Stalin didn't like the Home Army, and he wanted them and the Germans to finish each other off to save him the trouble. And I don't know what lesson there is from that, except that history is contingent. But let me find this part. Okay, so this part is it's based on the memoirs of a man named Jakob Pat, who had been a Bundist for most of his life, whose wife and children were murdered by the Nazis, but he had been on a fundraising tour in New York, so he survived the war. And he comes back in 1946 to deliver aid to Poland that is post-apocalyptic, where the country has just been decimated and where Jews are in many ways hunted. And the only scene of light that he sees in the whole country that he talks about in his book is a Jewish clubhouse and a Polish socialist clubhouse. And I'm going to read you that scene. At the newly opened Jewish Community Center in the Silesian town of Dzierżoniów, Pat heard the melody of the Blue Danube. Inside, hundreds of young people waltzed. They were Poles and Jews. The dancers demanded one song after the next. They whirled, their feet light, and the girls clung to the partners' shoulders. Pat stared at the numbers on their arms. At the Polish Socialist Party's clubhouse next door, the young secretary poured Pat a whiskey, and this is a Polish Christian secretary. The secretary spoke of solidarity, of the brotherhood of peoples. Pat stared at the numbers. He spoke about solidarity, of the brotherhood of peoples. He rolled up his sleeve to show the number on his arm. The secretary raised a glass. He toasted his friends, socialist resistance fighters who had been shot by the Gestapo. Bolek, Antek, Zdzisław, honor their memories. Let's drink to the memory of our Jewish comrades. Let's drink to our brave dead. Then he looked at Pat as if to seek forgiveness. Brother, believe me, we socialists are not guilty in all of this. I mean, the Jews and the other things. Believe me, I'm ashamed of what's happening in this country. The secretary spoke across a chasm carved by a genocide, and when I first read his words in 2018, I could not imagine myself in his place. He was a Pole. I am a Jew. My tribalism precluded understanding. But 2 years into the annihilation of Gaza, I feel only empathy towards him, along with my own inadequacy. What had I done to stop this genocide, still live-streamed on our smartphone screens? Not enough. The secretary had also tried to stop mass slaughter. His sacrifices were far graver than anything I could comprehend. Yet it didn't work. If we also fail, what chasm will we look across to seek forgiveness? The secretary's sentences trailed off until all that was left was a supplication. Comrade, brother, we socialists, believe me. I always tell people that the thing the Bund loved more than anyone else was saying that they were right and other people were wrong. So the best way to honor their memory is to give this book to someone in your life who is wrong.
Okay, Molly, I would love to come back to you with one more question and maybe a final reading. And thank you so much for everything that you have imparted tonight. It's such a special, not even just to think how much information you just carry. It's sort of almost, it's written on your soul, I think, this book. It's really quite extraordinary to interview, and such a privilege for us all to hear you. But something that I think, I told you this when I finished the book, I was on a train to Glasgow and I started crying, is you make this very powerful distinction in the book between loss and failure. And I was wondering if you could tell us why that's such an important distinction, and maybe close us out with a reading that speaks to that.
I think I'll just do the reading,
Okay.
because I feel like the reading says it more eloquently than I will on the spot. Okay, they were right, one friend told me after he finished my manuscript. Right and dead. What's the big lesson you want us to take away from all this? After all, the Bund failed. Lost, I answered, more sharply than I meant. What's the difference between failed and lost, he responded. Failure is what happens to those overcome by their own faults and errors. To lose is to succumb to greater force. Here I confess a secret. I didn't just write this book out of scholarly devotion. I had a hidden hope. By studying the Bund's history, I wanted to find out if there was some way that my people, the Jews of Eastern Europe, could have saved themselves. The more I wrote, the more I realized the wrongness of my premise. Though individuals escaped in various ways, there was no way out for Eastern European Jews as a collective, not as long as they were fighting alone. No small minority could have rescued themselves from the horrors of the 20th century. Despite astounding feats of heroism, cunning, and creativity, they couldn't hold Hitler back, nor the intractable hatred of so many of their Christian neighbors. The Bund could not change the balance of force. Neither could any other Jewish group in Eastern Europe, whether assimilationist or Zionist, capitalist or communist, Hasidic or Christian convert. 9 million scattered humans can't defeat vast armies of organized killers. The accusation of failure isn't one we should level against the Bund or any other Jewish group of that place and time. It's for the Western world of which they were such a precarious part. It was the West, after all, that hypocritically paid lip service to freedom and humanity while hewing to the crude doctrines of might. The true failures were the democracies who played nice with Hitler in the early years, then shut their doors to Jewish refugees who fled from the hell they helped enable. The failures were the British and American diplomats who hobnobbed in Bermuda while the ghettos burned. The Western world failed the Jews of Europe when they refused to provide the basic solidarity that the historical moment demanded, the solidarity upon which the Bund's humanism relied. This betrayal allowed Zionism to present itself as the only possible salvation. If the world came down to strong predators and weak victims, Zionism, at least, offered Jews the possibility of strength. But Zionism is ethno-nationalism. Like all ethno-nationalism, it required mass murder to clear the land to build its dream. On this haunted territory, oppressed became oppressors. 70-odd years after they stuck their state upon another people's ruin, the inheritors of Zion would liquidate their very own ghetto in Gaza, beside the sea. For ethno-nationalism, this is what winning means. So why did I write this book about the Bund, who lost, who were failed, and not about victorious killers? Because I am sick of monsters, whether they belong to my group or any other. Because I know we all have the capacity to be victims and tormentors as well as bystanders, staring blankly at a burning wall. Because I want off the samsara wheel of atrocity, and the Bund's demand of solidarity across difference is the only way to get there. Such solidarity is fragile and frequently betrayed, but it is all we have. It is the only thing that can save us. There is no other earth, after all. We are trapped together on this one. It belongs to all of us as inheritance and prison. It is Egypt and the Promised Land.
Thank you, Molly.